Well, memory is an important part of our identity as individuals and as communities and as states as well. So it comes naturally to groups that the memory they cultivate is related to their present-day political preferences. In this way, it's quite easy to see that democratic states that respect human rights as an important value tend to remember differently from the states that are ruled by right-wing populists or authoritarian dictators. And unfortunately, there are such states in Europe. And so the connection is fairly clear. Very often, the states that display aggressive behavior prime their own population for that with a certain type of memory politics. It can also be seen that oppositional groups promoting democracy, fight back with a counter policy, with a counter politics of memory, which is in fact on behalf of the people and tends to emphasize the value of human lives of the victims as opposed to great victories of the state. The part of Europe I'm studying, unfortunately, is a good example of that. For many decades now, the Russian state refused to seriously engage with the issue of Stalinist repression, and it went after historians and memory groups who studied that particular question. It also, of course, came complete with a certain attitude to Stalin. And when the war began with the Russian aggression against Ukraine, sociologists, and of course the war started 8 years ago in 2014 really, what happened in 2022 was the all-out offensive. So when the war started 8 years ago, sociologists found a chance to poll people on both sides of the front about the kind of memory politics they share, or they have been educated with. And it turned out that the usual differences which people sort of assume when speaking about the Russo-Ukrainian war, they do not necessarily apply. The language, for instance, is very often Russian on both sides, with a tendency of more Ukrainian emerging on the Ukrainian side. But what really truly divides these groups is actually the attitude to the Soviet past. And so when Mr. Putin claims that it is war about history, it is actually a war about memory, and memory is connected to present-day politics. So those in the trenches on the Ukrainian side tend to know very clearly that Stalin was a bloodthirsty tyrant who organized the Ukrainian famine, the Holodomor, and killed many hundreds of thousands during the terror. Those on the Russian or pro-Russian side tend to believe that Stalin was a great leader in Russian history. And of course, Russian sort of entertainment opinion surveys that are run by television in many cases about the greatest historical figure in the history of Russia very often include Stalin as one of the top 2 or sometimes number 1, unless Mr. Putin himself is included, in which case, of course, he is number 1. And so then, Russia would like to present that conflict as being a conflict about World War II, but it really is about something else entirely. It is about the meaning of the Soviet experience and the kind of state, the kind of society people are now building during the post-communist period. Whether it's a type of society which is atomized, in which people cannot demonstrate publicly, there is no opposition in the parliament and there is no oppositional press, or whether it's a kind of society in which even the fallen are remembered in a very unique way, with individual portraits rather than some kind of abstract monument as in Soviet times with a great leader. And so, as you see, it translates easily into conflicts. It also translates easily into an agenda for the future, which can be very constructive and inclusive. And this is precisely what has been happening, in fact, with Ukrainian school curricula recently, when in particular, the fate of the Crimean Tatars is now seen and presented differently as that of the other nation in our motherland. And I found it actually very telling, because historically, of course, Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars, there is a lot of blood between these two groups, which is also the case, by the way, between Poland and Ukraine. And these relations, too, underwent a remarkable restart with the start of the all-out Russian invasion. So what really happened there was precisely part of my argument about individual human rights and attention to personal connections, because it was not, it was in fact an individually driven initiative by millions of Polish families to take in the Ukrainian refugees and assist them. So it was run at the level of personal ties, which then has the potential eventually of transforming state policies, because it's actually the people who did it. So there is some hope. There is some hope for that part of Europe and other parts of Europe, but it is really important to see what kind of democratic ideals can be reflected in memory politics. And there is a major role, of course, for the European Union in getting involved and providing education and training, in particular for the belt of countries located bordering on Russia and Ukraine. On the issue of the memory boom in today's Europe, I think it's important to understand that some political scientists and philosophers have been talking for decades about the end of history. It became a convenient metaphor, even so the field basically objected to it. But what was meant in there was, of course, the end of an ideological world, the end of the world in which the states would use ideology and historical memory to mobilize their populations against each other. It seemed for some time to me, as well as the others, that the notion of democracy itself didn't need to be supported by patriotic historical memory. It was supported by the memory of the victims and the memory of those of the saviors, essentially, in Europe. Elsewhere, it seemed almost devoid of historical memory as such, because as this was happening, the painful issues in the history of the Anglo-Saxon world, for instance, in Canada and the US, were not being addressed. So the issues of historical memory temporarily disappeared or went into background around the time when communism collapsed in Europe. And the end of the Cold War was celebrated by certain circles as the American victory. It seemed that the world was devoid of ideology, but it was not really. It was just basically seen as the victory of consumerist mode of consumption in North America, which basically did not require you engage in memory exercise in order to define yourself. And of course, the reaction to that came, and the reaction came in very different forms in Europe and in North America. The reaction came with the notion of right-wing populism actually opposing European values and democratic values with a historical memory aimed at mobilizing its own population. So history was brought back intentionally, politically, in order to fight democracy. And I find it extremely problematic and painful, actually. The European Union was trying to create an all-European memory which would be applicable worldwide by emphasizing the history of atrocities, of the Nazi regime and the Holocaust as the values which established the European understanding of what history is and what our values are. But the right-wing populists very often attacked these values from the point of view of their national history. And it happened at the same time when President Trump in the United States, was indicating his support for historical revisionism there as well. There, however, historical revisionism proceeded from the point of view that the Confederacy side in the American Civil War, deserves to be remembered, and it was a legitimate part of identity for people in certain Southern American states. So you see, this kind of counterattack of bringing history back originally came, of course, from the right. But of course, the answer to it on the part of the European Union and other countries could also be only historical. And it's also true of Canada and the United States, because that counterattack of the right wing, in fact, started for real the process of decolonization, which was much delayed in the United Kingdom, in Canada, and the United States. So the Black Lives Matter movement, the toppling of statues in Europe and right here in Canada, in Victoria, in fact, was part of that process of critically addressing history, which was not addressed. So history came back then in that part of the world as an instrument of dealing with past injustices which were not addressed. Whereas in Europe, of course, it was the right wing that organized a counter-offensive against the European Union's agenda of humanitarian remembering, of the remembrance of victims and saviors. And those countries with right-wing governments in Europe, in fact, went for challenging this agenda with traditional history by reclaiming the traditional nationalistic narratives. So that is the reason for the return of history, the return of historical memory, and that's going to be two different recipes for these two parts of the world, even so fundamentally they are similar. And of course they involve critical engagement with history and the promotion of the kind of memory which coincides with the state model, with the model of politics we believe in, the democratic politics. And the history is not going to go away anytime soon. I'm sorry.